Hi, I'm Antonia and I'm a first-year PhD at the University of Bath. My research looks at the activities of the alt-right on extreme and mainstream platforms during the US presidential election 2020. In this paper, I'll reflect on the state of online ethics in an extreme context, specifically focusing on research safety and working under PREVENT. I might not be able to answer all of the questions that I raised during this presentation, but I hope that it helps push the conversation forward and encourages professional bodies to release more guidance on these subjects, particularly to help early careers researchers. Ethics is baked into a PhD, from candidature right through to the final dissemination of the thesis. Working with extreme groups online sits you at the intersection of the ethics of terrorism and the ethics of the internet. However, I found that most online guidance offered by professional bodies posed questions and problems rather than concrete solutions. Whilst I appreciated this because it raised problems that I wasn't previously aware of and allows for a contextual approach and diverse methodologies, I argue that in the cases of research safety and working with the legalities of PREVENT, it fails early careers researchers and PhDs. This is because traditionally instincts and past experience are relied upon, and the guidance online focuses on the harm to the subject rather than the harm that may come to the researcher. I work with extreme right groups, which means, as Massanari has pointed out, I work under the gaze of the alt-right. They are a weaponized, anonymized swarm, and frequently the power balance which has sat with the researcher traditionally tips back in favour of the subject. There have been demonstrated examples where researchers have been targeted because of their research. Furthermore, PREVENT has been problematic when it comes to research, and I will be going into this more later. However, it has also resulted in arrests of researchers. I argue that unless we tackle this problem from a structural institutional level and reconsider the ways that we work, we risk having more and more danger put on researchers. Informed consent and anonymity are fundamental to an ethical approach, and this forms the bulk of guidance from institutional bodies. They are interrelated. If you cannot get informed consent, there is an even greater pressure on anonymity. However, I argue that research safety should take a much greater role in determining which approach you should take. I appreciate that a contextual approach allows for differences based on the environment and based on the subject. However, I believe that a much greater space in guidance should be given over to a consideration of safety. However, first I needed to determine the privacy expectations of the subject and whether I'm looking at a public or a private space. This is because ultimately, as researchers, we are still choosing to focus our lens on this particular subject. First, the privacy expectations. I'm lucky in that my subjects explicitly engage with this issue, with the issue of non-members in their space. They note on a sidebar that if a particular content is determined newsworthy, it is likely that it will be nationally reported on. Furthermore, there is the issue of private versus public space. It's a problem, especially when it comes to something like a forum, because you post much like a public notice board, but then you respond through comments, much like a private conversation. However, I argue that it's different from something like a chat because it's not live. You have a considered timed response where it may occur hours after the initial post. I've determined the space to be semi-public, and I've also chosen to go with paraphrasing because I argue that verbatim quotations can never truly guarantee anonymity on the internet because you can just simply search the original text. As I previously mentioned, I believe that research safety is an underserved area when it comes to guidance on ethics from professional bodies. This becomes particularly pointed when working under the gaze of the alt-right. The gaze of the alt-right is a term that I bring from Massanari's 2018 paper, which she understands to be an important imbalance of power between the spectators, those within alt-right communities, who remain shrouded in darkness, and the person being looked at, a particular researcher, who is rendered visible. The alt-right have a gendered and race subjectivity. Operation Digging Digger was a targeted campaign of harassment against gaming academics, which the alt-right claim as a topic. They harassed them across social media platforms, particularly Twitter, because they wrote in a way which the alt-right did not agree with. It underlines the constant risk that you are in academia when you work with or near the alt-right. As you can see from Becca Lewis's tweet on the side, this is ubiquitous, it's endemic. It's part of the experience of being a woman online. People of colour and women are particularly subject to online harassment, which becomes ever more problematic when intersectionality comes into play. The alt-right are also homophobic, so those in the LGBTQ+ community also face increasing harassment. However, the nature of academia clashes with supposed techniques to deal with this harassment. In order to advance, in order to make a success of your career, you're under pressure to be visible on Twitter, to publish papers, and to attend and present at conferences. This establishes a bank of resources that the alt-right can use, and as I've mentioned, they are very well versed in doxing, where they take your material and find more personal information and spread it online for malicious purposes. However, I argue that there is a further step we must take, which is we need to consider how we revisit violence on others. As I've mentioned before, there are people on the sharp end of this discourse, and we revisit this violence on them repeatedly when we use quotes verbatim. Even if we are just trying to underline a point or show how explicit the language is, people who are not necessarily working with this content or who are already snowed under by the effects of this content have to see it again when they're reading papers. There is no way to escape. Becca Lewis mentions in a separate tweet that just suggesting that someone leaves the platform is an insufficient way of dealing with harassment. This is because we are researchers of the internet. We cannot get off the internet. Furthermore, if you take steps and then there are still further suggestions such as, why don't you just block them? Why don't you just get off the internet? That feels like you're placing the blame at our door. We need to take more institutional structural steps to help researchers in these positions. Particular communities are on the sharp end of the discourse and the sharp end of the harassment. However, much of the strategies to deal with this is left up to the individual researcher and not the institution. Suggestions such as obstruction by removing the name of the community from your paper in order to perhaps avoid a Google alert on the name, or not seeking informed consent is not enough. Not seeking informed consent is something in that you will avoid the attention of the community perhaps for longer. You're not putting yourself at the mercy of the anonymous swarm, where they may choose or may choose not to harass you. An individual within that 2,000 perhaps member group may choose to harass you, but even one is too much. At an institutional level, we should be taking steps to support researchers undergoing this. There are impacts to emotional and mental well-being, not just from experiencing harassment, but also from viewing the content. Emotional and mental strategies should be more built into a PhD and early careers researchers. There is already an epidemic of mental health problems at a university, which exacerbates when you get to postgraduate level. I am lucky in that my supervisory team are very supportive. However, I understand that this is not always the case. Saying just block them or that blocking them is a weakness, not going public with your struggles in an attempt to protect yourself and your career is a very normal response to this harassment. I'm grateful to those who have spoken out in the past because they've given me advice which I haven't been able to find elsewhere. I'm also lucky in that my ethics board required extensive justification on how I'm going to protect my mental and emotional well-being before they approved my project. However, I argue still that it should be down to the institution to set up structures of support, rather than leaving it up to the individual researcher to set up a network. These networks are incredibly useful, and speaking out is how Becca Lewis started to receive support. However, as an early career researcher, reaching out can be nerve-wracking, especially when you are experiencing this for the first time. Prevent and the terrorism legislations 2000 and 2006 are problematic topics, which has been gone into further by other researchers. Here I'm specifically talking about the impact on future research and on safety, which particularly affects early careers researchers. I argue that this is the case because of the stringent requirements which this legislation puts on people without offering sufficient guidance. Academics have been arrested on these matters in the past. One such requirement is not directing people to terrorist material. This can be relatively straightforward, for example removing the URL, but you must also remove the source material. As I've mentioned before, verbatim quotations can simply be searched and then you find the source material. Paraphrasing is another solution to this issue. However, I have not been able to reconcile certain issues. For example, how do you maintain rigour? Can coding trees sufficiently demonstrate the movement from the content, the source material, to the arguments. Within this argument, there is the necessity to do this research outside the umbrella of the government and security services. Masumi, Mills and Miller's article is a brilliant insight into the ethics of government-sponsored research. There are frequent sidelines into unethical behaviour and also an absence of research and data sharing. I believe that it is important, especially under the more open data movement, to share the conclusions of the research and not keep it behind paywalls just within the government. Secondly, there is an impact on future research, for example through data sharing. There is the requirement to delete your data as soon as possible. In my instance, that has been interpreted as the close of the project or the end of the PhD. However, this problematises long-term or comparative studies as unrepeatable, unique data is being deleted. These issues affect people of colour and marginalised communities far more than someone like myself who is a white person. I argue that more guidance, more concrete, specific guidance that can be followed, should be released by the government in particular. Reynolds released an article approximately 8 years ago discussing this issue, and nothing has moved on since. There still is no guidance. This issue has been around since these legislations has been released, and as I've mentioned before, academics have suffered for this. I argue that more guidance needs to be released in future to safeguard researchers. As I've detailed in previous slides, when it comes to research safety and prevent, there are real serious failings when it comes to the guidance offered by both institutional bodies and the government. A survey previously noted a significant reliance on instincts and past experience when it comes to muddling your way through these ethical issues. However, I argue when it comes to safety and compliance with terrorism legislation, it fails early career researchers because this is not something you can fumble your way through. When it comes to harassment in particular, I argue that institutions need to set up more structures of support rather than leaving it down to the individual researcher to figure it out before they've had to deal with the issues. These networks of support are particularly useful. Becca Lewis has previously stated that it wasn't until she spoke out about what she was enduring that she got this support. These networks of support, talking to people who have also undergone this, have been useful for me because they offered me advice that I couldn't find elsewhere. For those at the sharp end of this discourse, where it is an inevitability rather than a possibility, institutions need to step in to safeguard the mental and emotional well-being of their researchers. It is likely that this will put off researchers promising young innovative research from taking place because there isn't the safety in place. We need to reconsider how we define success and promotion in academia, where the emphasis on impact, where you have to connect your name to real impactful research, negatively affects researchers in that they must suffer this harassment in order to progress in academia. Simply telling someone to get off the internet is not effective. Simply telling someone to get out of academia is not necessarily effective. I appreciate the need for contextual ethics, which allows for a diversity of methodologies and adapts to the different subjects that you're in. But I don't believe that contextual ethics negates the ability to offer concrete guidance on something like research safety, or negates the efforts we can make to come up with agreements on data sharing, data collection for terrorist material. I finally argue that researchers need to more explicitly address ethics in their papers, whether it is how they approach the issue of informed consent, how they approach the issue of anonymity. We need to more normalise issues of not getting informed consent, although this must be deeply thought through in order to protect the researcher from identification by these groups. The power imbalance shifts back to the subject frequently when you are working under the anonymous swarm of the alt-right, rather than traditionally it has sat with the researcher. Thank you for listening to this talk on something I'm so passionate about. I hope I have helped refocus the conversation towards research safety and an emphasis on more guidance, particularly when you look at the current state of the alt-right and their power on the internet. We need to refocus on the power imbalance and how sometimes it shifts towards the subject. I'd like to thank the PSA Early Careers Network for giving me this platform, something I'm so passionate about, and to my supervisors for helping me through quite an extensive ethics application that led to this presentation. and also the people who have sponsored my PhD at the SWDTP and the University of Bath. If you want to engage more with this topic, then my Twitter's up there, and I'd love to hear from you for any thoughts or feedback. Here are just a couple of citations that I used for this talk.